I got my start in the United States Army, and I was originally assigned to infantry, then Signal Corps, and then they moved me to the Quartermaster Corps in the Army, and they interviewed 84 of us, selected 4 of us to start up this new thing called Cost Schedule Control Systems Criteria at Headquarters Army Materiel Command. The first thing they did was send us to Air Force Institute of Technology, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. It was a 4-week class. They teamed us up with a number of people from Army, Navy, Air Force, because each service ran its own earned value reviews. Because the Air Force was ahead of us, we had them come in as a guest speaker, and Captain Hugh Langford represented them at the meeting I was at. I went out and chatted with him at the Coke machine at the first break and asked him how do you get on these reviews. And little did I know, he wound up being my mentor for a good 40 years. But when he got me into Northrop, or now Northrop Grumman and Hawthorne, F5 program, what he wound up doing is giving me the entire engineering area. So I got to go across a whole set of guidelines. Organization, work breakdown structures, dictionaries, scheduling, budgeting, the earned value techniques, all the logs, accounting, analysis, the whole spectrum. So I was sent out on my first reviews, Air Force reviews, St. Paul, Minnesota, Minuteman Weapon System Computer, and then as the Army representative. And then I was sent to Boeing in Seattle, AWACS, Minuteman, and SRAM, 3 program offices. So it was a Tri-SPO, System Program Office, Tri-Service, Army, Navy, Air Force review. And they put us on different teams. I think I led the organization and planning, scheduling, budgeting teams. We pulled the reports together. I think we were there 5 weeks. And Colonel Driesnack at the time came out, accepted our report, and they got certified or validated. That name's changed as we've gone through the years. We manually wrote things out then a secretary typed it up. We redlined it and did it again. The exhibits or figures were copies of copies, ugly Xerox, gray kind of things, but we covered all the content. We looked at every work package in every control account I was responsible for, every earned value technique. I added the budgets up, both time phasing and at complete. We really learned grassroots, bottoms up, and that was true of all the team because there's nothing automated like it is today. The next review, the Army had to start its own. We had to kind of stand on our own. And that was at Boeing Vertol in Ridley Park, Pennsylvania. So that was the first one where I was the Army Review Director, leading the first review that the Army led. Again, we didn't have a central like Defense Contract Management Agency running the reviews at that point in time. Army, Navy, and Air Force did their own. But we tended to want to be consistent because some of the contractors worked with Army, Navy, Air Force. So I would tend to get a Navy representative on my team and an Air Force representative, and they would try and get kind of a reciprocal agreement, people on the other team. So I was very lucky to have the opportunity to go and have lunch with Whitey Driesnack. We'd have a 2-hour lunch just to throw out a time frame there in the cafeteria, and I just got to pick his brain the whole time, and he wanted me to learn, and he wanted to share the wisdom. He just the perfect kind of person to share thoughts. I couldn't have been any luckier. So that's why I say, if anybody asks me, maybe I'm one of the older guys in the game now, but I'm really truly in the second wave. But we were all forced out because they were cutting back budgets at the time. They didn't need us. So all 4 lieutenants were pushed out of the service. Then it went down to the next level of command, so it tended to be dominated by civil servants. But the point is, those people then, it kind of went decentralized. And then Larry Stone came in there, and he would still oversee. He pulled in a couple people after us, like Wayne Abba and Steve Bauer, a couple of others that are still around. Wayne, of course, is still in the game. Steve Bauer does other things, but that was kind of the way things evolved on the military side of it. On the other side, starting consulting, it was a wonderful shopping list coming out of the Army, Navy, Air Force. They had a schedule of reviews, which was under Freedom of Information, accessible to anybody and everybody. So it was kind of a shopping list. These people just won these contracts. Here's how big they are. Their cost plus incentive fee, award fee, whatever. Here's where they're located. So we then targeted those people as people we could help by training, and then help them with their definition of the work, with the work breakdown structure and dictionary, the scheduling of that work, the integration of the costs with the schedules, and then doing mock reviews to make sure they were ready for the real review. So that kind of launched us. There were close to 100 certifications or validations in each decade. So we had a lot of issues that came up. How to define management reserve, how to use it, when and how undistributed budget should be defined and used and logged in. This resulted in a lot of different opinions from contractors who wanted to share this with the government people and get some kind of guidance. So it was at that point in time we had the National Security Industrial Association, NSIA, and I learned that we had people from what was then IBM Federal Systems Division, later part of Lockheed Martin, and Sanders Associates in Nashville, New Hampshire, also later part of Lockheed Martin. These people were very active in addressing these topics. How should we deal with this? How do other people approach that? So I found that it was a good forum for us to exchange ideas. And this is like the mid, 74, 75. This is early in the game that people recognized they had a need to share thoughts with others. And the government enjoyed it because we were not being unequally unfair with one contractor A versus B.
Shortly after I went to work in the Pentagon with Gary Crystal, he took me along to a periodic meeting with the National Security Industrial Association, NSIA, and it was an ambush. We went into that meeting, and I wasn't on the podium at that point. That was Gary's job. So he was up there with some of the other government defense leaders from the services. And people would stand up in the audience and ask questions that they had discussed, obviously, the day before. And they struck me as being, when are you going to stop beating your wife types of questions. And as we left the meeting that day, I remember one of the industry leaders coming over and sort of tugging on Gary's sleeve and saying, Gary, we have to do something about improving the relationship between government and industry. This isn't working. And as a result of that, Gary gave me that charge to go out and find better ways to get along with these folks.
They formed the Performance Measurement Joint Executive Group. I'm not sure the exact time frame of this, but I know it took the right environment. So Gary Crystal and Wayne Abba were in the Pentagon at the time. They acknowledged the need to have more sharing of concepts and thoughts to come up with a more cost-effective approach to earned value, cost schedule control systems criteria. A lot of contractors were complaining that it was too harsh to adhere.
Over a period of time, as happens with any kind of government process in my experience, it becomes overly bureaucratic. Some people refer to it as over-implemented. And one of the things that was an artifact of the earned value process was the creation of a system description by the contractors that were being reviewed. And this process had deteriorated to the point that a review that I was scheduled to be a member of at a shipyard was delayed for years because the PIMJEG member for the Navy demanded that the company have a satisfactory system description before agreeing to take a team into the plant. That took years before that was done. It left a bad taste in everybody's mouth. The book ended up being written by a consultant to satisfy people in Washington, not to actually identify the way that the shipyard was being managed.
So after a number of years, a lot of contractors had certified, or we used to call them, I still like to call it validated systems. And perhaps they didn't have a contract for many years, and they became a little stale. Maybe their managers forgot the basic use of the system, and maybe the tools became a little bit less than useful. End result was a new kind of review was created, subsequent application review, or SAR as we tended to call it. And it had been a really long time, and they tried to apply it to a different site. We might have an ESAR, an extended subsequent application review. So these were a lot like an initial review, but a lot different from the integrated baseline review that we've talked about at a different point in time.
We found that the bureaucracy was so deeply entrenched that it took just an inordinate amount of time. And the cost of taking all of this time for these reviews of these contractors was that we didn't have effective management of an instant project or a contract. And so we sat down, Gary and I, and said, well, how long should it take a contractor to create an effective plan for even a large complex project? And we agreed that that was probably about 6 months. And so we said, well, instead of doing all of this earned value review, why don't we kind of subordinate that? The secondary reviews that were being done, the follow-up reviews, were known as subsequent application reviews. And we thought that there were too many of those and they were taking too long. So why don't we do a review of the contract oriented towards risk and planning to accomplish that particular contract? And let's make it a technically based review. And so Gary said, we'll do that. We'll call it a technical baseline review, or TBR.
In this ADM, the program managers were charged with conducting a review of their performance measurement baselines. I called it a technical baseline review. It actually the name was changed and corrected by Wayne Abba and Gary Crystal at OSD, and they renamed this process the Integrated Baseline Review, or the IBR. So I was the first pathfinder, if you will, for the first 2 IBRs that took place in OSD.
The bureaucracy, the bureaucratic process associated with CSCSC came to a head for me on a review that was conducted in Texas. It was the most powerful earned value review I had ever seen. By that time, we were working with our international partners, and this contract was joint with Australia and the US. So we had Australian leadership on the team, we had US leadership on the team, we had participation from Canada, from Sweden, and it was Army, Navy, and Air Force. It was amazing. I'd never seen anything like it. I was coming back from a trip in California and stopped at this review, and they had resolved everything that had been found. And I thought, this is a case study for doing something better, faster, smarter, obviously cheaper. So rather than having the tri-service validation report reviewed by all the services when they got back, I went back to a meeting in Washington the very next week, and I challenged the people from the PMJAG, the Performance Measurement Joint Executive Group, to accept the results of that review, and gave them a week to do that. And at the end of the week, all but one had agreed. And they thought that this one member thought that we were taking too much of the authority from the services and refused to go along. And as a result of that, Gary Crystal and I sat down and decided that the lifespan of the PMJAG had come to an end. It had served its purpose, and it was time to find a more efficient way of doing it. And so at that time, we set up the then Defense Contract Management Command as the executive agent for earned value management. And that was executive agent in small letters, meant that they were in the same chain of command as we were. Later, that phrase was somewhat misappropriated to give the organization more apparent authority than they had.
The first time I first heard it and even dealt with earned value and work breakdown structure was when I was really my first job after college, in which I was working for Computer Sciences Corporation as a consultant to them. And I was able to work at the Department of Energy. And at that time, they already had something that was similar to EVM and work breakdown structures, but they wanted to update it because the Air Force had actually done a big job of implementing earned value management and work breakdown structure into their policies. So they actually hired the people who did the work for the Air Force and wrote the policies and brought them into the Department of Energy, and they were as consultants as well to Computer Sciences Corporation. So I got tagged as my first job is to actually work with them on developing the Department of Energy's next generation of earned value management and work breakdown structure. So I became involved in the mill standard in 1988, about 10 years later. I had joined a company called Management Consulting and Research, and I had been asked by the vice president of the company if I knew anything about work breakdown structures. And oddly enough, from my past experience, sure enough, I had helped write the work breakdown structure policy for the Department of Energy. So I said, sure, I was able to do that if he wanted me to help in developing work breakdown structures. And he said, well, he had a customer at the Office of the Secretary of Defense who needed to update Mill Standard 881 at that time A. And I actually sat down and met with the person who was in charge of that, and her name was Jerry Asher. Unfortunately, the work breakdown structure had not been, the mill standard specifically, had not been updated since 1973. And here it is 15 years later, and you can imagine there's been a lot of changes in how you develop a system and so forth. One big example was the fact that they still had key punch cards in the discussion in the 1973 edition. So that's how I got started with the mill standard. That was, by the way, a 5-year project because they hadn't updated that in so long. Everybody had their own opinion of what a work breakdown structure element and support was.
The name was changed from Cost Schedule Control Systems Criteria to Earned Value Management System Criteria. The concepts didn't really change. How you adhered to them might be a little different, but it was the same stuff by a different title. Ooh, criteria, that says we must adhere, thou shalt do. Why don't we soften that? So a lot of contractors were trying to get a little bit of relief. The name was changed from Earned Value Management Systems Criteria to Earned Value Management System Guidelines. And the theory being that this is a nice noble target to shoot for, as opposed to thou shalt adhere. So this played very well with the contractors, but it was a wonderful interchange of thoughts and ideas. Defense Contract Audit Agency also played in that arena. We documented the results of that, what was called interpretive guidance, and we'd cite the guideline, we'd write a paragraph or a page or a couple pages on each issue, and it was then shared with everybody in industry. So it was a great leveling influence. Then we decided that system descriptions were incredibly different, and why should they be that different other than your own unique policies, practices, tools? So why don't we try and get those closer? Because some were too prescriptive and others were not prescriptive enough. And they varied, not that size matters, from 50 pages to 300 pages. Some were a lot more prescriptive than they needed to be, and some were less than they needed to be. They'll tend to have subordinate procedures desktop instructions and so on to support it. So we started what was in the rage process action team, and the process action team that I headed was for system descriptions. So we would have sitting in the room around the table, General Dynamics, Boeing, Raytheon, sharing each other's system descriptions. We found we couldn't get through them very fast. So we made the, like if it was a General Dynamics issue, they would send in their paragraph or pages on earned value techniques, if that was something they thought they were over or under killing. The rest of us would read it, and then we'd talk about it, and we'd make suggestions. It was like free consulting from everybody in industry, a very positive stroke for everybody there. As a result of that, we did a few other things, like decide that we should present something that would be a little bit more palatable, watered down, that people could relate to in terms of cost schedule management. So we then started, and we finally finished in 1998, what was called the American National Standards Institute, ANSI, EIA, Electronics Industry Association. They gave it a number 748.
It's been a long road in this, and it's changed over time. When we first started the mill standard and updating it, we did it strictly with government people. And they were determining what the system would look like and how it would be designed and so forth. And finally, after a few times of doing that, we decided, and actually it was my decision, is to say we really need to have industry be a part of the discussion instead of part of the review. And so we actually brought them in, and it has become, for the last several times, probably since the 2011 version of this, that we've really taken a very strong opinion from the industry side and felt that they had that right to have that. So it's a joint effort, though, and both the military and the government folks who are supporting, as well as industry, are working collaboratively in this effort. A lot of compromise, you might imagine. A lot of it has to do with what the government would like to see in reporting, but at the same time, industry wants to make sure that they have a WBS that matches what they do in terms of how they build and develop systems. So I think it's a good combination.
So some of the times under this theory of relationships weren't always perfect between contractor and the earned value teams and or their customer program offices, or even between the customer program offices and the earned value lead people. There's been some dissension in terms of this compliance and oversight set of situations. So sometimes organizations will have backed off on their surveillance, and unfortunately there have been a couple of times that's resulted in an ugly surprise. So the one that came out was the Navy aircraft A-12 program, and the end result was 2 certified validated contractors were teamed on that, and they defined the work, scheduled and budgeted. They had a really technically challenging project. Nobody had ever done what they were trying to achieve, stealth capability, etc., taking off and landing from a ship. First time ever, a tough job. So while they were doing the planning and scheduling and earning and doing their analysis, they were doing all that, and they were adhering to their own principles and to those of Earned Value Management System guidelines. The only challenge was they were too optimistic on their estimates to complete. They felt, none of us was trained to fail, they felt they could turn it around and get it there. So they were awarded a low rate initial production go-ahead, and then what came out somewhat soon thereafter is that the configuration wasn't firm yet, and that there was a need to go back and reassess some of the design characteristics of that. The end result was they canceled the program. Another significant event occurred as a result of the A12 project, kind of kicked off by Wayne Abba and Gary Crystal. And the suggestion was, if we've got data there and we've got cost and schedule performance indices, have we ever really seriously looked at those? So they caused a funding, and Air Force Institute of Technology, Dave Christensen, who I believe was an Air Force captain at the time working on his master's thesis, in fact, got 400 sets of data from programs from the beginning of the program. He was able to look back because he learned he knew where they ended in terms of schedule and cost performance. And he learned that things settled in at 15 or 20%, that the cost performance indices tended not to get better. And of course, a lot of people view this as a real negative discovery and, we should just give up, we'll never get better. But the real purpose was to cause you to focus in on those parts of the project that were your greatest technical and therefore schedule and cost challenges. This was the first real serious survey where we looked at the data intently to discover the things that we needed to discover, and I think was very important. I wish they'd do one every 10 years or so, because I think we learn a great deal from that. The importance of that survey is that information was shared and people were very interested in what they could learn by looking at CPIs, cost performance indices, and schedule performance indices. The end result was each of the services got even more interested in it, and another survey was commissioned, I think again by Wayne Abba and Gary Crystal, and this time they examined at different points in time, 20th percentile, 50th percentile, and 70th percentile complete. And then they broke out by Army, Navy, Air Force, and they broke out again by research and development versus production. And they learned some things like, perhaps, for example, the Air Force may have been better at predicting at the 50th percentile complete on a research and development program than the Army. Well, that was fascinating information to a number of us and to a number of contractors. But the flavor that I'm trying to share here is that contractors and the customer community were sharing and using the data to see how it would help them more proactively manage their projects. So what happens if they'd have gotten in earlier on this one particular program that we're talking about? The suggestion is they could have applied these indices and projected forward where they think they're going to finish. Gary Crystal, in an afternoon, took the data from that program and he just kind of manually calculated out some indices, and he projected forward where he thought this project would end. And he argued, and he learned this in about 4 hours, that there'd be like a slip of a year and $1 billion, a lot of money in 1991, had we looked at the data coming out of the systems. So he faulted not the contractors or the government customer, it was the U.S. Navy, but the whole process, that people weren't sitting down together looking at what the information was. And had they done that, and had they not had shades of gray, they would have thought more intelligently and come up with a better range of a best case, worst case, most likely. So that's what evolved. Prior to that, we only had one estimate of complete coming out of contractors. The contractor team said, if you'd have given me the opportunity to give you a best case, worst case, most likely, I could have at least given you a range and we could have talked about that and come up with some more intelligent discussions and co-manage this thing a little bit better. It was right after that we now have 3 estimates of complete on all the then cost performance reports evolved to contractor performance reports, now the integrated program management report. So that was a huge change in terms of at least external reporting because of that project, and a lot of surveys were kicked off because of that project to see if we could learn anything.
There were a couple of major events that really influenced Gary Crystal's thinking and led us to take things in different directions. One was the disastrous experience of the A12 termination for default. And we played a role in that, which is went on for years and years. I served as an expert witness with the Navy and the Department of Justice litigation team. And the other one was Clinton-Gore acquisition reform. And in the case of the A-12, what we realized was that we had good information that was clearly showing that we had large problems on programs and people were not using it effectively. We had to find better ways to do it. The Clinton-Gore acquisition reform gave us an opportunity to go out and do things in a different way. Now, earned value came under strong attack in Clinton-Gore. You have to recall that all specs and standards were canceled, completely canceled. Mill Standard 881, work breakdown structures, went away. Our office took the leadership in bringing that back as a military handbook. And so the capability was able to survive this change, and eventually, as you know, it restored as a mill standard. It's a mill standard again today. Well, I would submit to you that without Gary Crystal's involvement, earned value would have disappeared at the same time. But rather than fight this conclusion that earned value was too expensive and too bureaucratic and so forth, he said, basically, you know, you're right. He said, these are problems that we need to work on. And so he set up teams with industry to go out and figure out where the problems were and to find ways to resolve them. And from that came a new, very exciting era of earned value management.
The future of earned value management and work breakdown structure is kind of interesting. I think they may take some different paths. Within the work breakdown structure, I think where we were talking about a product-oriented structure, I think we're going to start seeing different types of structures now. Even process-oriented, functionally oriented type structures where in the past we would never allow that. But I think today's environment and how we are creating and building new systems gives you that opportunity to look at it a little differently. But I also think it has a lot to do with technology and the fact that within computer systems now you can look at things in many different ways, shapes, and forms without losing that relationship. So from a work breakdown structure perspective, I think we're going to see some changes in terms of what I said was the 100% solution. It will probably be a 100% solution for processes, for functions, for locations, for you name it. It's that type of situation. So I think that's where the future is there. As far as earned value management, you know, it's always been on the cusp of either being great or being gone. People either love it or they hate it. And it's one of those things that has been around for more than 50 years, so clearly it's lasted quite a while. I think it's going to change from its rigidity with how they handle it. I think we're going to have to look at earned value as not only a performance measurement tool, but as hopefully one that would help the industry and government understand where things are going earlier in time rather than being later in time. The biggest complaint is always that I get earned value information after the fact. Again, I think in today's world of technology and the use of more systems to develop and build things, you'll have that real-time information. And I think that that will make earned value a lot more valuable in its future and hopefully to go on at least, if not more, 50 years beyond.